Okay, folks, in the interest of time, because we have a lot to get through today, we're going to go ahead and kind of kick off. So my name is Paige Sparks. I'm one of the Women in Science Committee members here at the Martinos Center. Joining me today is Lissa Manning, who is also a Women in Science Committee member. We have the great honor of having Dr. Jonathan Jackson come talk to us today, giving his talk about racism and the history of racism in research. For those of you that don't know, Jonathan is the Director of Community Access, Recruitment, and Engagement, also known as CARE at MGH. And has been doing some really great work. He has a connection to the Martinos Center. That's actually where he and I met a number of years ago, and we're really honored to have him. One note is that we are recording the talk today, so I want everyone to know that. Without further ado, Jonathan, do you have anything else?
No, I'm good to go. Is this where I get started?
I think so.
Okay. All right. In that case, I'll just say good afternoon to everybody. Thanks especially to Lissa and Paige for inviting me back to a space where I gave so much of my time and energy and discovered a lot of these truths that I'm about to tell you. Thanks to the Martinos Center and Women in Science in particular for reminding us that there can be no racial equity without gender equity and vice versa. And finally, of course, thanks to all of you for being here and getting ready to listen to my rambling for the better part of 45 minutes. But first of all, before we go through and talk about these things, we need to talk a little bit about who I am and why you should potentially listen to anything that I have to say. My name, as was just stated, is Jonathan Jackson. I am the director of a small research center at Mass General Hospital called Community Access, Recruitment, and Engagement. The name's a little bit of a mouthful, so we just call it the Care Research Center. We really focus on improving access to clinical care and research through inclusive design and strong, deep community entrenchment. But originally, I came to Boston to research the early detection of Alzheimer's disease. And I need to make that very clear. That's really all that I am. I'm just a clinical researcher. I'm not any kind of revolutionary. I never had any intention or frankly interest to take on disparities in clinical care and research or for advocating on behalf of marginalized communities. But it is kind of funny how some of these things just happen to us. Quick word of warning, and I give this word of warning before each and every one of my talks. I will say before I was pushed in the direction of thinking about past abuses and disparities in research. I published a few papers on mind wandering in my time. So if you check out for about half of the next 45 minutes or so, you are right on track for most people. So don't even worry about it. I'll bring you back with my words if I'm lucky. Before we get into today's conversation, or today's discussion, or today's rambling or lecture, or whatever you want to call it, I wanted to share a little bit about me, not because I enjoy doing this, because I really, really don't, or some excess of vanity, in which case, well, I hope that's not true, but rather because I think that my personal autobiographical journey reflects an evolution of what racism is and what it looks like in society and at Mass General, and even, yes, here at the Martinos Center in 2020. So let's take it all the way back to the beginning. This is me just under 34 years ago. As you can see from this photo, I have a strong reputation for being thoroughly no nonsense. I grew up in a small town called Ben Wheeler. You can see it here with a red star. In the heart of rural East Texas. The town is so small that they don't really bother to count the population on any kind of regular basis. So it's just assumed that there are between 300 and 400 people there, but certainly no more than that. Fun fact is that the residents of Ben Wheeler, Texas are outnumbered 20-1 by feral hogs. And every October, they crown a hog queen at the annual Feral Hog Festival. And yes, I'm pretty sure they're going to be doing this next month. Coronavirus be damned. Y'all know that only a town full of white folks like this would go around dressing up in pig costumes. In fact, I attended a school so white, and for y'all in the back, you can say, how white was it? It was so white that for a full year, several classmates and teachers, they just called me Black Boy. Didn't bother learning my name. My brother, my younger brother, was nearly brought up on drug charges for daring to take his asthma medicine during school hours. But as I got older, both friends and foes concluded that, one, because I knew who my father was, two, because my family hovered just above the poverty line rather than below it, three, because I speak like this, and four, because I made good grades, that obviously, of course, naturally, I wasn't really Black. Now, I want to tell you something. I'm really no kind of activist. I promise I'm not, but I am Black. So while working on my doctoral degree in cognitive neuroscience at Washington University, I spent about 6 years in St. Louis, where I was frequently, and it was frequently, detained by the police for the unfortunate crime of being Black near an affluent institution. On one memorable occasion, I was accused of stealing my own bicycle. This was in the years before the world heard of Michael Brown or the Ferguson Police Department, but my experiences there made it clear that no matter what I had been told growing up, no matter what these exceptions that people had in their minds, I was Black first and everything else second. I am not any kind of scholar or historian of the Black experience, but I am Black. And yet, I can say that I have never been made more aware of my Blackness than during the 7 years I've lived in Boston. You know Boston. It's that city that's in a northern state. Well-meaning white liberals often demand that I speak on behalf of my race, desperate to build up credibility with their equally misguided other white liberal friends. And collectively, they slap me on the back and ask me how proud I am that America defeated racism when Barack Obama gained the White House. You know, it's actually kind of funny because those questions have stopped in the last couple of years, and I can't quite put my finger on why. But you know there's always something. So now I get to decode Beyonce's Black Parade visual album and explain why you can't touch a Black woman's hair. These Bostonians are the people who use words like microaggression, like white privilege, but they use them as weapons. They use them as epithets to be directed at others rather than as tactics that they themselves are unconsciously promoting. In moving to this utopia of liberal coastal elites, I have reckoned with the reality that it is worse to call someone a racist than to allow them to perpetuate racist acts. I have been forced to learn here in Boston what racism really means in 2020. Of the masterful dance between intentions and impact. I've learned about the 1,000 cuts of the token tax, of emotional labor, of switch tracking, and if you haven't heard of some of these, you should be taking notes. I understand that most people see individual racism as abhorrent, but systemic, structural, contextual racism, that's just simply the way we do business. Meanwhile, also in Boston, Black men ask me for the dates of my next talk, not because the information is compelling, not because they think I'm a good speaker, but so that these Black men can show their Black sons that it's possible to be something other than a rapper, an athlete, a jailbird, a statistic. I'm not any kind of role model, I promise I'm not. But I am a Black man with a degree and a good job. So with that in mind, let's begin. Let's break down some of this stuff. In my line of work, I know that Blacks may be twice as likely to develop Alzheimer's disease as whites. Yet, Blacks routinely make up fewer than 5%, sometimes less than 1%, of Alzheimer's clinical trial participants. The same is true of clinical trials and other research studies in neurology, and generally for most advanced therapies and observational studies across the board. Doesn't matter what the topic area is. As a result, coming back to Alzheimer's disease, the source of Blacks' increased dementia risk remains a mystery. We simply don't know. We have a few theories, but we don't know. And even worse, if things remain as they are, when some of you on this Zoom call succeed in finding a treatment for Alzheimer's disease, as you soon will, truly, we won't know how it affects people of color. And let's be frank, who's going to go looking if that's the case? Analysis after analysis shows that the same disparities that rule the day in our halls of learning and our halls of justice apply equally in our halls of science and our halls of learning. Racial disparities in diabetes alone kills far more Black Americans in a week than police brutality kills in a year. And much more recently, much closer to home, we can see here in this recent analysis by Nancy Krieger's group that being Black in Massachusetts, or even a resident of a town that's predominantly Black, is detrimental to one's health amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. And we already know that just over 1 in every 1,500 Blacks in America is already dead from COVID-19. That's just since March. That's 6 months. 1 in 1,500. Of all forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhuman. In 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered these words to a crowd in Montgomery, Alabama, after a long, brutal, exhausting march from Selma. At the time, Dr. King may have been referring primarily to contemporary issues around health and race, but he also, in uttering these words, gave voice to concerns around medical abuses against the Black community, past and present. Across all indicators of health, and this is a surprise to no one on this call, the Black community remains woefully underserved. This is not a modern phenomenon. And as with all medical matters, it is worth understanding the history of health disparities to best contextualize their persistence to the present. According to writer and scholar Harriet Washington, this is partially rooted in the debilitating effects of 17th to 19th century medicine on Blacks in America. So whereas you have rich, healthy, white slave owners that could withstand things like primitive bloodletting, look at these pictures, they're wonderful, and skull drilling, look at that. These procedures were often deadly for overworked and malnourished enslaved Africans. Early American doctors, and listen closely, early American doctors mistook these differences in health outcomes. They mistook these differences in health outcomes for inherent racial differences. And in fact, American founding father Thomas Jefferson himself proclaimed, "Never bleed a Negro." And I really want you to remember that. The side of privilege not only won't, but oftentimes they can't understand the side of disadvantage, and they invent reasons, citing God or science or medicine or Medicare reimbursement rates to justify why the world is the way that it is. These things have happened, and make no mistake, they continue to happen, even in the age and the era of the novel coronavirus. But the big question is, why and how do these differences persist? What is the history of health disparities in America where your zip code predicts lifelong mortality? Well, it turns out that many, many roads lead back to this man, Samuel Cartwright, an influential doctor from Louisiana in the years before the Civil War. And just so there is no confusion here, this dude is the worst. I mean, the absolute worst. So now that we've very clearly established that, you need to know that in the mid-1800s, Dr. Cartwright wrote a series of scientific articles that claimed that Black brains were up to 10% smaller than white brains, that they were unusually shaped, and therefore were so primitive that Blacks could not survive without being cared for by whites. It was Dr. Cartwright who coined the disease term drapetomania, which is a so-called mental illness that drove Black slaves to flee captivity. Note, turns out that if you were a white servant who fled your master, you couldn't be coined with drapetomania. Cartwright also came up with dysesthesia ethiopica, which is another invented disease that described Blacks as mentally unstable, that described them as lazy, disobedient, diseased creatures, and that the most effective treatment for these maladies was excessively hard outdoor labor, beatings, and sometimes, in extreme cases, cutting the big toes off of each foot. It is easy to be outraged by how blatantly racist this was. But I want you to think for a moment about the power of these medical terms. Drapetomania, dysesthesia ethiopica. It is much harder to fight racism or even recognize racism when it claims to be something scientific, something medical, something essential and inherent. It is so easy to reject lies when you know something about the topic, but much more difficult when it's obscured behind slanted words and statistics. These things have happened, and make no mistake, they continue to happen. And I hope that in this awful year 2020, we can really begin to recognize the power of words, especially in a medicalized context. Anyways, it was Dr. Cartwright's observations that brought America into the era of scientific racism. The idea that one's skin color could determine whether an individual belonged to one of several distinct categories of human. So naturally, Western European whites tended to have the most desirable traits, and blacks were close enough to whites to be used for experimentation, but they were fundamentally less evolved. They were weaker. However, according to Cartwright, there were some advantages, some perks to being black. So for example, he believed that some illnesses affected the highly evolved white body more than the primitive black body. In particular, he argued that syphilis, while debilitating and deadly for whites, would prove mostly harmless to blacks' unevolved nervous systems. Some of you might see where I'm going with this. This idea from this man that syphilis wouldn't really affect black people would be the basis of the Tuskegee syphilis study conducted for 40 years during the 20th century. And so again, we see that same recurring theme, the side of privilege, the side with the advantage. They can't understand the side of suffering. And so the privileged invent ironclad reasons, even if they're ridiculous, to justify the difference between us and them. And if no one tells them, if we refuse to acknowledge that this system, even here at Massachusetts General Hospital, if we can acknowledge that this system is biased, then nothing changes. So on the back of Dr. Cartwright's research, remember that guy who's the worst, 80 years later, in 1932, the US Public Health Service began the study of syphilis in the untreated Negro male. For 40 years, 40, the federal government monitored 399 black men who already had syphilis. This is one of the things that people get confused by. At no point was syphilis given to these men. The US government did that in Central America a little bit later. Instead, the government watched as these black men lived with and spread syphilis to others, including at least 40 wives and 19 children. The victims of the study were never told that they were being studied on the basis of their syphilis, or even that they had syphilis, or that they were being studied. The US Public Health Service maintained that they were giving free health care to poor sharecroppers in Macon County, Alabama, but they did withhold effective treatments from these men. So what we're gonna do now is get a little bit of audio visual. I wanted to show a clip from a 1993 NOVA program that interviewed some of the survivors of Tuskegee. And there's also some reenactments in this clip from a staged version of a play called Miss Evers' Boys, which is a play based on Tuskegee.
The Public Health Service pushed for syphilis treatment programs, but not for the men of Tuskegee. They were systematically excluded, and if they sought out help, they were tracked down and stopped. This happened to Herman Shaw when he went to Birmingham, Alabama for treatment.
When I got there, I saw a lady, a nurse pacing through the camp, talking about she was disturbed and thinking she'd been looking for someone that wasn't supposed to be there.
There are 2 patients in this treatment clinic who do not belong here. Is there a man here named Willie Johnson? Is there a man here named Caleb Humphreys?
Yes, I'm here. Over here, Nurse Evans. You wearing a new hat.
What are you doing here, Willie Johnson?
See, what are you doing up here? I said, well, they told me I had to come up here. They sure you got to go to Birmingham. So she said, come here, come here.
That doctor did not know you were a government patient. If that doctor had known that, he wouldn't have sent you here. Now you get back on that bus to Tuskegee.
And they gave me breakfast and put me on the bus and sent me back to town. I said, you didn't supposed to be here. I said, you're in Macon County Clinic.
All right, so we heard from one of the survivors that they were prohibited from getting care anywhere else. So these black men, grew sicker and sicker. Autopsy reports show that between 1/3 and half of their deaths were completely and directly attributable to syphilis. This study, believe it or not, was never particularly hidden from view. It wasn't a secret. Researchers published reports about their findings every year, just like we do. However, calls for the study to end began around 1965 as part of the civil rights movement, but they were largely ignored until July 1972, when a journalist, Gene Heller, broke the story with the Washington Star. The New York Times picked it up the following day, and the study was shut down within a couple of weeks. But even in 1993, not everybody agreed that the study was wrong. We've got another clip here.
One of the few surviving public health service doctors who worked on the study still defends that decision. John Cutler.
It was important. They were supposedly untreated, and it would be undesirable to go ahead and use large amounts of penicillin to treat the disease because you'd interfere with the study.
So I want you to keep that in mind. Dr. Cutler felt that you would interfere with the study if you treated syphilis in these men. So just think about what that prioritizes and what that means about Black lives. We're done talking about that. Now let's talk about Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks went in for cervical cancer treatment in February 1951 at Johns Hopkins University, where her cells were harvested without her permission by George Guy. After her death in October of 1951, without the permission or knowledge of anyone in the Lacks family, Guy directed his assistant to harvest more of her cells while her body was at the Hopkins autopsy facility. So these cells, which most of you know are called the HeLa cell line after Miss Lacks, they went on to revolutionize biology and medicine, from polio to cancer to AIDS to stem cell therapies. Neither Miss Lacks nor her family have benefited from their work. In the 1970s, when the cell line became contaminated, the Lacks family was bombarded by requests from the scientific community to provide new samples. That was how they learned that the Lacks cell line had been harvested more than 20 years earlier. In the 1980s, the Lacks family medical records were publicly published without the family's knowledge or consent, and over decades, a litany of federal rulings have shut them out from any proceeds made from the Lacks genes across any of the 10,000 patents associated with the HeLa cell line. Even as recently as 2013, a group of German researchers published the entire genome of Miss Lacks cells, which contained identifying information from living members of the Lacks family. Some may say that the gains in care that we received from Henrietta Lacks' cell justify the underhanded means that we use to get it. They may say that abuses like we saw at Tuskegee are overblown, that they are few and far between. To the doubters, to the defenders, I have two words for you, and that's just buckle up. Let's talk about James Marion Sims. You've heard a lot from me, so let's hear from Vox Media and ProPublica, who published a report on Dr. Sims back in 2017.
People. And then, of course, there was James Marion Sims, whose reputation is etched in history and on that statue in Central Park. Between 1845 and 1849, Sims began performing experimental surgeries on a 17-year-old slave named Anarcha. He eventually performed 30 operations on Anarcha and more surgeries on about 11 other female slaves. When his male colleagues could no longer bear to assist him in inflicting pain on the women, the slaves took turns restraining one another. Yet paintings depicting Sims, Anarcha, and other slave women presented a subdued version of his experiments. Even though anesthesia was introduced in 1846, Sims chose not to use it for his experimentation with slaves. His practices echoed one of the most prevalent and dangerous beliefs in medicine at the time, that Black people did not feel pain or anxiety.
I just wanted to say that they took down that statue in Central Park of Dr. Sims about 2 years ago, but it doesn't erase the disparity that still remains. In the end, it was white women who benefited from Dr. Sims' work and Black women who suffered disproportionately. Moving on, in 1927, hospital workers in Lyle Station, Indiana, exposed the heads of 10 Black children to radiation in order to study its effects. The children and their families were told that the doctors were treating ringworm, which was a lie. Every single child was horrifically disfigured, and most were socially isolated despite wearing hats and wigs to cover up their injuries. Vertus Hardiman was 5 years old when this happened to him. He was 5. As a result of his radiation exposure, Mr. Hardiman's skull bones slowly dissolved over the course of his life, resulting, as you can see here, in exposed brain tissue and agonizing pain. He went on to work for a hospital for 40 years, and he never missed a single day of work. Despite his immense suffering, he told no one of what happened and kept his head covered for more than 70 years. He is often revered for his noble restraint, and I think it's really easy to laud him for that, but I want you to think about that great cost of silence and how it didn't stop the same thing from happening to hundreds of Black children around the United States for more than 4 decades afterwards. Note, too, that parallel human research protections had already been put in place by the American Medical Association and the Atomic Energy Commission. None of these mandates protected the lives of Black children. Not one. Have you ever called someone an idiot or a moron or maybe imbecile? Well, I'm sure that some of you already know that these are medical terms from the early part of the 20th century, but they were originally used to describe the Black resistance, especially Black war vets who anchored those very early civil rights movements. By being labeled as an idiot or a moron, an individual, often Black, could be forced to undergo institutionalization or sterilization. These medical terms, ones that we take for granted, ones that we never associate with Blackness, were used to destabilize, they were used to destabilize those very early activist efforts. So there's an emerging theme here when we talk about drapetomania, dysesthesia ethiopica, idiot or moron. These are all rooted in the idea that there's a fundamental difference between people who look like me and those who do not. And it remains at the heart of medicine today, as we try to explain away the health disparities we see by claiming that Blacks have genetic weakness or inherent habits that fully explain for their suffering. These things have happened, and make no mistake, they continue to happen. Anyways, I'm actually not done talking about these medical abuses. Let's keep going. In 1945, Ed Cade, a trucker from North Carolina, was involved in an automobile accident at the nuclear reactor in which he worked. So this was during the height of the Manhattan Project. He was severely injured and with many, perhaps dozens of broken bones. Without his knowledge, without his consent, before even setting one of those broken bones, Mr. Cade was injected with about 5 micrograms of plutonium-239. That's about 41 times the normal lifetime exposure. Then, just for funsies, they pulled 15 teeth, took bone samples, and waited somewhere between 5 and 20 days before setting his broken bones. They renamed him HP-12, Human Product 12. Ed Cade remained in the hospital for 6 months before escaping. Doctors were pretty disappointed because they were hoping to trigger several different types of cancer in Mr. Cade's body before he died. Between 1960 and 1971, Dr. Eugene Sanger at Cincinnati General Hospital exposed 150 Blacks to high doses of radiation, again, just to study its effects. Participant consent documents were forged. One family said that a woman who had never learned to read or write nevertheless had a flawless signature on file. 84 victims died within a few weeks. Later, Dr. Sanger's colleagues said on trial that they chose their radiation subjects because, and I quote, "These persons don't have any money and they're Black and they're poorly washed." You know, this is just the beginning when it comes to these kinds of stories. We don't even have time to cover Dr. Joseph Goldberger, who purposely induced pellagra in Black prisoners to win a fucking bet, or Dr. Chester Southam, who injected bed-bound Black women with cancer cells with the backing of the American Cancer Society, or researchers at Johns Hopkins who tested the blood of 7,000 Black children to look for a biological predisposition to crime. Imagine what that means, that we have an hour and I have to leave out some of the abuses that researcher scientists like you and me have done that drive home a systemic disregard for Black lives. The medical atrocities, you guys are gonna love this, of the 20th century, these medical atrocities were so appalling that they were admired and copied by the Nazis as they experimented upon countless numbers of Jews during World War II. That's right, they got it from us. Indeed, during the Nuremberg trials, Nazi doctors noted that they were only following the example set by American doctors of the 20th century, and indeed, they were better than their American counterparts, since they claimed that they only used prisoners condemned to death rather than innocent civilians. Now, I want you to think about that. The most outsized villains in centuries, you know, the ones that white people are surprised that came back. These villains defended their horrors by saying, at least we're not as bad as those American researchers. Let me be clear about something. The majority of these and other experiments specifically targeted Blacks because they were convenient, that they were disposable, and they were unlikely to speak out. I hope you can understand that this problem was systemic. It wasn't just a few bad apples. And it necessarily continues to the present in ways that can often be hard to articulate. The common thread in all of these stories is the high cost of silence, of accepting these horrors as normal and routine, of ducking your head down and staying away. Let's talk a little bit about what happened after Tuskegee. The Belmont Commission was created in 1974 as a direct response to the Tuskegee syphilis study, and a final report was published in 1979. How many of you knew that the Belmont report arose because of Tuskegee? The recommendations of the Belmont report were accepted in their entirety, and over the next few decades, most federal agencies adopted this as our set of human research protections. It was clear at the time that people of color suffered disproportionately from the lack of oversight, that they faced coercion, that they faced bullying, and they had no channel with which to register their concerns. These principles, respect for persons, beneficence, justice, guide every aspect of human subjects research to this day. And the way the story goes, it put a swift end to medical abuses. At least that's what we're told in graduate school or medical school. Maybe that's what you're telling yourself now, to draw a comfortable line of distinction between what happened then and yourself now. Well, these ideals aren't exactly working. You need to know that these things are still happening. In 1990, the Centers for Disease Control injected 1,500 Black and Latino babies in Los Angeles with an experimental measles vaccine that was associated with an increased mortality rate in children in 3 other countries. The parents were not told that the vaccine was still in the investigational phase. And in 1997, researchers at Columbia University administered Phenfloramine, you know, Fen-Phen, that stuff that was banned. They administered Phenfloramine to 126 Black boys under the age of 10 and breached juvenile court records in the name of health. Moreover, this study was targeted at children of color, specifying in an approved IRB protocol that whites were not eligible for participation. The assumption was that race was the primary risk factor for male aggression. 2 decades later, we're still studying just how bad the effects of Phenfloramine were on these kids. But as appalling as all of these horrors were and are, as much as we have been abused by historical precedents in the healthcare system over centuries, the real danger is not in being taken advantage of by rogue researchers, but in being ignored by them altogether. So let's go back to that report by Vox and ProPublica for just a minute to understand the link between this past and the present.
In a lot of ways, Sims epitomizes the story of American medicine for Black women. It's a system that's failing them to this day. From infant mortality to life expectancy, The racial disparities in healthcare are staggering. The gulf between Black and white might be widest when we look at maternal mortality, with Black women 3 to 4 times more likely to die in connection with pregnancy or birth than white women. And that divide can be traced back to doctors like Sims, who contributed to a long, largely overlooked history of institutional racism in medicine.
Trying to understand a historical problem without knowing its history is like trying to treat a patient without eliciting a thorough medical history. You're doomed to failure.
Now, I don't want anyone to think that the current climate of disparities happened because of the Belmont Report, because that's not true, and that's not what I'm saying. The Belmont Commission put together a lot of excellent rules to prevent things like Tuskegee from ever happening again. But the commission failed to truly solve one of the problems that they actually identified, which is the problem of justice. The Belmont Report and additional measures by federal agencies over the next 25 years made it clear that people of color were to be treated with different rules, which meant that many medical researchers either didn't know how to reach our communities or they didn't care to try. So the Belmont Report, like so many protections that came before it, was designed to solve one problem at the cost of another. I said at the beginning of this talk that in America, more Blacks are killed in a week from diabetes than police brutality kills in a year. That wasn't exaggeration, because here's the data. What you see here in blue are fatal police shootings, annual, and what you see here in green are deaths from diabetes, Black deaths from diabetes on a weekly basis. Every week, we lose hundreds of Black lives at more than double the rate of whites to one disease, just one. This graph should be an outrage. But we remain quiet, we remain silent, and this is the cost that we pay. Ordinarily in a speech, this is the part where I'd put in something that's known as the call to action. I'd say, don't despair, let's fight back, and here's how. I'd show you how easy it is to solve this problem in the hopes of motivating you, yes you, to solve this incredibly timely issue. But I can't tell you what to do next. We don't have the data. All I can do is sit before you on this dumb Zoom call and say that on behalf of generations of clinical researchers that I am so sorry that this happened. I'm so sorry. If you feel unsatisfied and frustrated by that apology, if you feel that it's not appropriate for a Black man to apologize for centuries of white mistakes, abuses, violence, then know that I agree. But the Black community is no more likely to get an apology from anyone else. And even if they did, no matter who it was from, let me ask something. Would that be enough? Because all I know is that the Cold War that we've been waging on Black communities since the Belmont Report, since Tuskegee, isn't working. Our focus on privileged white communities in our research, our assumption that we don't deserve Black mistrust of the healthcare establishment, our silence in these matters has begun to harm Black lives more than Tuskegee ever could. It is not our fault, but it is our responsibility to find a solution. So take whatever anger and frustration and shame you feel and use it as power to find a better way forward. We need transparency and connection and compassion, because we may not be the heroes that we're waiting on, but you know what? We are here. I can tell you what has been done by people in situations much like yours. Remember, the point of the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, the legacy of Black History Month, the point of this talk isn't just to honor and remember what's come before, it's to prepare for what's coming next and to recognize what's happening around us right now. Fortunately, there are very clear examples of what to do. So let's start with Dr. James McCune Smith. This was the first Black American to hold a medical degree, but he had to get it from Scotland, and guess why? Dr. Smith trained in medicine as well as statistics and used his training to combat the fake news of the day about race. At least in some parts of the country, he was able to successfully rebut the entrenched views that people had had for 2 generations about essentialized differences between blacks and whites. And where do you think those ideas came from? Came from this guy. So James McEwen Smith was one of the first scholars to argue against phrenology, which was yet another medical field that justified treating Black Americans as second-class citizens. He worked with Frederick Douglass to emphasize the importance of getting educated, not just in terms of school knowledge, but also how the world worked. Who else might inspire us? Again, history points us in the right direction with Satima Poinsett Clark, who joined the NAACP just over a century ago to allow Black teachers and principals at the school where she taught. Then she did the same for the whole city of Charleston, South Carolina. She fought for pay equality and won in the courts again and again. Ms. Clark and her cousin Bernice, because you know she had a cousin Bernice, then went on to create literacy courses and literacy schools, teaching Black men and women to read, to obtain driver's licenses, to sign checks, and how to register to vote. Rosa Parks was one of her students, along with 25,000 others. By 1969, 700,000 Black Americans became registered voters, all down to Miss Clark's efforts. She created leaders, and in so doing, she sowed the seeds for the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. Ms. Clark once said, knowledge could empower marginalized groups in ways that formal legal equality couldn't. W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Martin Luther King Jr., they all agreed with her sentiments and supported her efforts directly. And in fact, MLK said the civil rights movement could not have happened as it did without her. I also know that in 1972, in this very city, medical students at Boston City Hospital rose up to protect Black women from unnecessary hysterectomies done for the sake of medical residence practice. You can actually look up this study published in the Boston Globe about this and realize that we're still connected to a system that does not value lives equally or even equitably. We have to rise up and build in protections for those Black lives. In order to protect, we as Blacks, we as researchers, we as physicians must engage and be involved. The Black community's isolation from clinical research, Black mistrust of the healthcare establishment, and our silence in these matters has all harmed us in advancing accessible healthcare for ourselves, for our families, for our children. We must find a better way forward. We can't tackle the problem raised if we don't talk about it repeatedly and often. Yes, even here in Massachusetts, that northern state where people would rather swallow tax than admit that racism exists here. Indeed, in the early years of giving this very talk, I was chastised by your colleagues that still work here for making mountains of molehills, for being depressing, for invoking the Black Lives Matter name in this talk's title. When you face this kind of behavior, and you will, I hope you recognize it, I hope you confront it, for the sake of the Black lives that paved the way for your research career. Beyond that, you and we will have other opportunities along the way. My research center takes every chance to speak on local and national television, radio, print, and social media. We work to influence policy at the State House. We write white papers. We advise FDA and NIH on policy. We generally try to move beyond internal conversations, because this truly is where the future of medicine is going to happen, outside of the clinic, outside of the lab, shaping the systems that are in play before patients, participants walk in the door. If you are interested in helping to mobilize Blacks to take charge of their health, please get in touch with me after this talk. You can also simply email me at jjackson31@partners.org anytime. My Care Research Center sponsored, organized, or were directly part of well over 70 events last year, and we routinely partner with national organizations like the NAACP, the Prostate Health Education Network, the Urban League, the Boston Public Health Commission, disease advocacy organizations, community action groups, community health centers, municipal, statewide, national administrations to prove access for Black lives and the lives of many others who are voiceless. You wanted a call to action? Here it is. At this point, you know what I know. You can no longer afford to be indifferent, hoping the right person will come along to make things better for underserved communities. You, because you have sat and listened to some fraction of these words, might be 10, might be 90, are that right person. United States Senator Mike Enzi is noted for saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. We, on this call, this afternoon, must be at the table. What we do next, frankly, what you do next, is entirely on you. That's the meaning of empowerment. So don't leave this Zoom unaffected. If you have a voice, you must speak. You have words, you must write. If you have shoulders, you must bear some of the weight of this responsibility. I firmly believe that the next great advance in Black lives must advocate for Black health. And so that starts with all of you here on this call. So remember civil rights activist Septima Clark. Remember Dr. James McCune Smith. Remember especially 5-year-old Vertus Hardin. If we can't find a way to empower ourselves to resolve health disparities, to resolve power imbalances, Black people will keep dying. So I leave it to you, I leave it to each and every one of you to apply the lessons of Black history to a brighter future that includes all of us. And you know what, I'm done. I'd be happy to open up discussion on how we can do this together. Thank you so much for your time.